At exactly 8:47 p.m., the sound of a crystal glass shattering against polished wood cut through a room designed for power. And for a moment, no one moved, because every person seated at that table understood that something far more valuable than glass had just broken. A man worth over $300 billion had lost control, and in a world where control was his currency, that alone was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned executives around him. Men and women who had built careers on certainty, now staring at their screens as if answers might suddenly appear where logic had already failed. Because the truth was simple and terrifying at the same time. His empire, a vast network of logistics, artificial intelligence systems, and financial infrastructures that quietly powered much of the modern economy, was less than 12 hours away from a failure that would not just cost money, but credibility, dominance, and the illusion that he could not be challenged. And as he slammed his hand against the table, demanding clarity, demanding solutions, demanding someone more strategic, the silence that followed was heavier than any answer they could have given, because there were none, at least not from the people who were supposed to have them. And that was when something shifted, something subtle that most of them missed entirely. Because while they were focused on protecting their reputations, someone else in the room had been quietly observing everything, not from a position of authority but from the edges, where people are rarely noticed and even less often heard. And it was there, standing with a tray in her hands, that she watched, listened, and understood more than anyone else in that room, though no one would have guessed it. Not from the way she carried herself, not from the uniform she wore, and certainly not from the assumptions they had already made about her. Assumptions that would soon cost them far more than they realized, because the truth is, power has a way of blinding those who hold it. And that night, it blinded them all to the one person who could have changed everything long before things reached the breaking point. And what happened next would force a man who believed he controlled outcomes to confront a reality he had never prepared for. That sometimes the person who holds the solution is the one you have already decided does not matter. And before we go any further, before the layers of this story begin to unfold in ways that challenge everything you think you understand about power, perception, and value, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this is not just a story about a collapsing system or a billionaire under pressure. It is about the moment everything shifts, the moment silence breaks, and the moment someone everyone overlooked decides to speak. And when she does, nothing in that room will remain the same. In the minutes that followed, the room did not erupt into action the way it usually did when pressure hit its peak. Instead, it settled into something far more dangerous, a quiet uncertainty that no one wanted to admit out loud, because every person seated at that table had been chosen for one reason: to solve problems that other people couldn't. And yet here they were, staring at a situation that refused to respond to logic, models, or experience. And at the center of it all was Daniel Sterling, a man who had built his empire on the belief that every problem had a solution if you had the right minds in the room, which is exactly why what was happening now made no sense to him, because he had already gathered 12 of the most accomplished experts he could find: engineers, analysts, strategists, each with credentials that demanded respect, each with a track record that justified their presence. And yet not one of them could explain why the system continued to fail at the exact same threshold. Not one of them could offer a solution that didn't create new risks somewhere else. And not one of them could give him the certainty he demanded. And that was the part that unsettled him the most, not the failure itself, but the absence of clarity, because uncertainty was something he had spent his entire career eliminating. And now it was sitting across from him, unmovable, undeniable, and growing more dangerous by the minute. While just a few steps away, unnoticed by most, the waitress remained exactly where she had been, her posture steady, her attention fixed not on the chaos of the room, but on the fragments of information being exchanged, the patterns hidden beneath the panic, the inconsistencies no one else seemed to question. And though she had said nothing, though no one had asked for her opinion. There was something about the way she watched that suggested she wasn't confused at all, that she wasn't overwhelmed, that she was, in fact, arriving at a conclusion the others had somehow missed. And it was this quiet contrast that begins to raise the most important questions, the ones that linger just beneath the surface of everything unfolding in that room. Because who was she really? And how could someone standing on the margins understand what 12 experts could not? What exactly was this problem that had defeated every conventional approach thrown at it? And more importantly, why did it seem as though she was seeing something entirely different from everyone else? Something simpler, something clearer, something they had overlooked, because within minutes, while the discussion at the table continued to circle the same dead ends, she reached a point of certainty that none of them had been able to find. And though no one had realized it yet, though Daniel Sterling himself had not yet turned his attention toward her, the reality had already begun to shift. Because the answer they were searching for was no longer a question waiting to be solved. It was a conclusion waiting to be heard. And when that moment came, when she finally chose to speak, it would not just challenge their assumptions, it would expose them, and force a man who demanded precision to confront the possibility that he had overlooked the only person in the room who truly understood the problem. And that raises a question that cannot be ignored. Was it luck, or something else entirely? Why did no one else see it, and perhaps most revealing of all, why did Daniel Sterling, a man who prided himself on recognizing value instantly, hesitate, even for a moment, before trusting her? To understand why that moment carried so much weight, you have to understand Daniel Sterling long before the glass shattered, long before the silence settled over that room, back to a time when he was not surrounded by executives or protected by layers of influence, but standing at the edge of an industry that did not expect him to succeed. Because Daniel Sterling did not inherit his empire. He constructed it piece by piece, decision by decision, with a level of precision that left no room for error and no tolerance for excuses. And over the years, that approach hardened into something more than discipline. It became identity, the belief that every outcome could be engineered, every variable accounted for, every risk calculated and neutralized before it ever had the chance to surface. And it was this belief that elevated him, that allowed him to build a company that quietly positioned itself at the center of global movement. Not just physical goods crossing borders, but data, transactions, entire systems of coordination that most people never see but depend on every single day. Because if something moved, if something shifted from one point to another anywhere in the world, there was a strong chance that Daniel Sterling's algorithms had influenced it in some way, guiding decisions, optimizing outcomes, ensuring efficiency at a scale that few could truly comprehend. And this level of control did more than generate wealth. It reinforced a mindset that left no space for randomness, no appreciation for coincidence, because in his world, luck was nothing more than a failure to understand the system deeply enough. And that is why, sitting at that table, facing a problem that refused to behave according to any known model, he felt something unfamiliar, something he had spent his entire life avoiding. The realization that there might be variables he had not accounted for, that there might be perspectives his system had never considered. And while that thought unsettled him, it had not yet crossed his mind that the answer might be standing just a few feet away, carrying a tray, moving quietly between conversations, blending into the background in a way that made her almost invisible to everyone else in the room, because the waitress had learned long ago that invisibility could be an advantage. That when people do not expect anything from you, they stop filtering what they say, they stop guarding what they reveal. And over time, she had turned that into something far more valuable than it appeared, because she did not simply hear conversations. She studied them. She noticed the patterns in how problems were described, the gaps between what was said and what was meant, the subtle inconsistencies that others overlooked in their rush to respond. And night after night, moving through rooms like this one, she had built a quiet understanding of systems not from textbooks or boardrooms, but from observation, from piecing together fragments of information that most people dismissed as irrelevant. And on this particular night, as the executives debated, as they repeated the same conclusions in slightly different forms, as they circled around a problem that refused to yield, she did something none of them thought to do. She paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of focus, tracing the structure of the issue in her mind, recognizing something familiar in the way it behaved, something that did not align with the explanations being offered. And while they spoke in complex terms, layering their analysis with technical language and defensive reasoning, she remained silent, watching the screens when she passed by, absorbing just enough detail to confirm what she was beginning to suspect. And when one of the executives mentioned the system failing consistently at 90% load, there was a slight shift in her expression, a brief moment that no one else noticed, because to them it was just another data point. But to her it was something else entirely, a pattern that didn't belong, a signal that pointed to a different kind of problem, one that could not be solved by doing more of what had already failed. And in that moment, without saying a word, without interrupting the flow of conversation, she reached a level of clarity that had eluded every expert in that room. Not because she had more information, but because she was looking at it differently. And that difference, that quiet, deliberate way of thinking, is what set the stage for everything that would follow. Because she wasn't listening casually, she was calculating. And while Daniel Sterling and his team were still searching for answers, she had already begun to understand the question they should have been asking all along. By the time the clock moved past 9, the problem was no longer theoretical. It had begun to show signs of real-world consequence. Subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss if you were not paying close attention. But inside that room, where every fluctuation carried meaning, it was impossible to ignore, because the system Daniel Sterling had built to operate with near-perfect efficiency was doing something it had never done before. It was hesitating, not failing outright. Not collapsing in a dramatic or obvious way, but stalling at a precise point that made no sense to anyone trying to fix it. 90% capacity, every time without exception. And what made it even more dangerous was not the failure itself, but what followed. A chain reaction that rippled outward through connected systems, slowing operations in one region, then another, creating delays that compounded into disruptions. And as the projections updated in real time, the implications became clear. If this continued into the scheduled global rollout in just a few hours, the damage would not be contained to a single sector or a temporary setback. It would cascade across networks. Contracts would be breached. Partners would lose confidence. And the carefully constructed image of reliability that defined Daniel Sterling's empire would begin to fracture in ways that could not be easily repaired. And yet, despite the urgency, despite the mounting evidence that time was no longer on their side, the conversation at the table began to unravel rather than sharpen, voices overlapping, theories contradicting one another, each expert defending their interpretation while quietly undermining the others, suggesting hardware instability, then dismissing it, proposing a security anomaly, only to find no evidence of intrusion, shifting toward scaling limitations that did not align with previous performance data. And with every passing minute, the tone of the room changed from controlled analysis to something closer to panic, though no one would use that word out loud, because to admit panic in front of Daniel Sterling was to admit failure. And failure was the one thing he had never tolerated, not in his company and certainly not in himself, which is why when he finally stood, when his patience gave way to something sharper, something louder, it did not feel like an escalation. It felt inevitable. His voice cutting through the noise with a clarity that silenced every argument in an instant, demanding not another theory, not another explanation, but a solution. And when none came, when the room offered him nothing but hesitation and uncertainty, he delivered the one line that would echo long after that night was over, a line that was not just a command, but an indictment of everyone seated before him. Bring me someone more strategic. And for a moment, for a brief and uncomfortable moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because there was no one left to bring, no higher authority to call, no hidden expert waiting to step in. just the same group of individuals who had already failed to deliver what was expected of them. And in that silence, heavy and undeniable, something shifted again. Something small but decisive. Because while the executives remained frozen, caught between pride and uncertainty, the waitress, who had until that point remained exactly where she was, stepped forward. Not abruptly, not with hesitation, but with a quiet certainty that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. And though her movement was subtle, it carried a weight that no one immediately understood. Because in a space defined by hierarchy, by titles and authority, her presence did not belong at the center of anything. And yet there she was, closing the distance between observation and action, stepping into a conversation she had never been invited into, and in doing so, setting the stage for a moment that would force everyone in that room, including Daniel Sterling himself, to reconsider everything they thought they knew about where real solutions come from. The moment she stepped forward, the reaction was immediate, though not in the way you might expect, because instead of curiosity or relief, what surfaced first was resistance, subtle at first, exchanged in glances between executives who had already decided, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever she was about to offer could not possibly be relevant. And in a room built on hierarchy, where authority dictated who was allowed to speak and who was expected to listen, her presence at the center of the conversation felt out of place, almost disruptive, and one of the senior analysts was the first to respond, not with a question, but with dismissal, a polite but firm attempt to redirect her back to where she belonged, as if the problem itself required protection from voices that did not carry the right credentials, while others followed, reinforcing the same assumption in slightly different ways, suggesting that the situation was more complex than it appeared, that it required specialized knowledge, that it was already being handled, and through it all, Daniel Sterling watched, not intervening, not endorsing, but also not stopping her. And that hesitation, that brief pause where he chose observation over control, would later prove to be one of the most important decisions he made that night. Because while doubt filled the room, she did not react to it. She did not defend herself or attempt to prove her place. Instead, she did something far more effective. She focused entirely on the problem, stepping closer to the screens, studying the data as it updated in real time, tracing the behavior of the system across different conditions. And when she finally spoke, it was not to challenge anyone directly, but to ask a question, simple on the surface, almost too simple for the complexity of the situation, and yet precise in a way that immediately shifted the direction of the conversation. Why does it fail at 90 and not 89? And for a moment, no one answered, not because the question was unclear, but because it forced them to confront something they had overlooked, something they had accepted without examining. And as they began to respond, offering explanations that leaned on probability, thresholds, and system limits, she continued, not contradicting but narrowing the focus, asking what changed at that exact point, what decision the system was making that it had not made before, what assumption it was relying on that might not hold under pressure. And with each question, the structure of the problem began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to introduce doubt into the conclusions they had been defending. And still, the resistance remained, because abandoning a theory is never easy when it has already been presented with confidence. And so the room moved into what felt like progress, but was in reality a series of familiar detours, suggestions of hardware instability that did not align with the consistency of the failure, concerns about a potential security breach that produced no evidence when tested, arguments about scaling limitations that contradicted previous performance benchmarks, each idea explored just enough to seem thorough before being quietly set aside. And through it all, the clock continued to move, from 12 hours remaining to 6, from 6 to 3, each reduction tightening the pressure in a way that made every delay more costly, every misstep more visible. And as the time narrowed, the tone of the room changed again, less defensive now, more urgent, because the possibility that they were running out of answers was becoming harder to ignore. And it was in that shift, in that growing space between what they knew and what they could not explain, that her presence began to take on a different meaning, not as an interruption, but as an alternative, a perspective that had not yet been exhausted. And though no one had said it outright, though Daniel Sterling himself had not yet given his full trust, the reality was becoming difficult to deny, because while the experts had been circling the problem, she had been moving through it, step by step, question by question, drawing closer to something that felt less like a theory and more like an understanding. And as the final hours approached, as the margin for error disappeared almost entirely, the room began to realize that the answer they needed might not come from where they had expected at all. By the time the room reached that final stretch, where every passing minute carried consequences that could no longer be softened or delayed, the conversation had thinned into something quieter, more focused, not because the answers had been found, but because most of the familiar ones had already failed, and it was in that narrowing space that she finally chose to speak in a way that could not be dismissed, not as a question this time, but as a conclusion, and when she did, the shift was immediate, not loud. Not dramatic, but precise enough to pull every ounce of attention toward her, because what she said did not add complexity to the problem. It removed it, and in doing so, exposed something no one else had been willing to consider, that the system was not failing in the way they had been describing it. It was behaving exactly as it had been designed to behave, only under conditions that revealed a limitation none of them had accounted for. And as she walked through her reasoning, step by step, referencing the same data they had all been studying but arranging it in a way that told a different story, it became clear that the issue was not instability, not intrusion, not capacity, but something far more subtle, something embedded in the logic itself. Because at 90% load, the system began to hesitate, not physically, but mathematically, waiting for a level of certainty it could not achieve under pressure, attempting to validate its decisions with a degree of precision that delayed action just long enough to trigger a chain reaction across connected processes. And as that delay compounded, the system responded by correcting itself, then correcting again, amplifying the instability it was trying to prevent. And when she reached that point, when the pattern aligned in a way that left no room for alternative interpretation, she stated it in the simplest terms possible. It's not breaking, it's overthinking. And for a moment, the room did not react, not because they disagreed, but because they were processing what that meant. Because if she was right, then every solution they had proposed was built on the wrong assumption. Every attempt to stabilize the system had only reinforced the behavior causing the issue. And without raising her voice, without seeking approval, she moved to the next part, outlining what needed to change, not in technical jargon or layered explanations, but in a sequence that made the adjustment feel almost obvious once it was seen, that the system needed to be allowed to act before it was certain, to make decisions based on probability rather than perfection, to move and then adjust rather than wait and risk collapse. And as she explained the concept of adaptive correction, of introducing controlled flexibility into a structure that had been designed for absolute precision, the implications settled over the room in a way that no previous theory had managed to do, because this was not an additional layer, it was a shift in approach, a recognition that the pursuit of perfect outcomes had become the very thing preventing them. And when she finished, when the explanation reached its natural conclusion, there was no immediate response, no interruption, just a silence that carried a different weight than before, not uncertainty, but realization, and one by one, the experts who had dismissed her began to see the alignment between her reasoning and the behavior they had been unable to explain, their expressions shifting from resistance to recognition, while Daniel Sterling remained exactly where he was, his attention fixed on her in a way that suggested he was measuring more than just the solution. Because, for the first time that night, the problem in front of him made sense again, not because it had changed, but because someone had finally described it accurately. And in that moment, the balance in the room began to shift, quietly but unmistakably, as the person who had been invisible at the edges became the one everyone was now waiting to hear from next. What followed was not immediate celebration or relief. at least not in the way the executives had expected, because while the adjustment was implemented with urgency, while the system began to respond differently almost as soon as the changes were introduced, there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where everyone in that room held their breath, watching the data not as analysts, but as witnesses, waiting to see if the logic she had laid out would hold under real conditions. And as the load increased, as it approached the threshold that had triggered failure every single time before, the familiar hesitation did not appear. The delay that had once cascaded into disruption was gone, replaced by a flow that was not perfect, but stable, adaptive in a way the system had never been allowed to be. And when it crossed 90% without collapsing, when it continued past the point that had defined the problem for hours, the realization moved through the room in a quiet wave, not loud, not chaotic, but deeply felt, because the crisis that had seemed inevitable just minutes earlier was no longer unfolding. It had been stopped, not by the combined effort of the experts who had been tasked with solving it, but by a perspective none of them had considered until it was placed directly in front of them. And yet, even as the system stabilized, even as the immediate threat began to fade, Daniel Sterling did not react the way anyone expected him to. He did not acknowledge the team. He did not issue instructions. He did not shift his focus back to the broader implications of what had just been avoided. Instead, he remained still, his attention fixed on her with a level of concentration that suggested he was processing something beyond the solution itself. And when he finally spoke, the question he asked was not about the system, not about the implementation, but about her. Where did you learn that? And in that moment, the dynamic in the room changed in a way that could not be reversed, because the question itself carried an admission that no one would have imagined hearing at the beginning of the night, that the person he had overlooked, the person he had not even considered as part of the discussion, was now the one he needed to understand. And when she answered, she did not present it as a revelation or a correction. She stated it simply, that before this, before the uniform, before the long nights moving quietly through rooms like this one, she had worked in environments where systems behaved in similar ways, where precision was valued to the point of becoming a limitation, where decisions were delayed in pursuit of certainty, and where the consequences of hesitation were far more immediate than anyone realized until it was too late. And though she did not expand on it, though she did not offer a detailed history or attempt to redefine how she was seen, what she revealed was enough to fill in the gaps that had existed around her presence, enough to explain how she had recognized the pattern so quickly, enough to challenge every assumption that had been made about her the moment she entered that room. And as that understanding settled, as the executives who had dismissed her began to reconcile her insight with their own failure to see the same thing, the shift in status became undeniable, not announced, not formalized, but clear in the way the room responded to her now, in the absence of interruption, in the attention that replaced dismissal. And for Daniel Sterling, a man who had built his identity around control, around the ability to direct outcomes and anticipate results, this moment carried a different kind of weight, because for the first time that night, the structure he relied on had not led him to the answer. Someone else had, someone he had not chosen, someone he had not recognized. And in that realization, there was a subtle but powerful change, because control, as he understood it, had shifted, no longer centered solely in his decisions, but shared, however briefly, with the person standing across from him. And though he did not say it directly, though he did not need to, the way he looked at her, the way he held that moment without interruption, made one thing clear to everyone in that room, that respect, once withheld, had been replaced, and that the balance of power, even if only for that moment, no longer belonged entirely to him. In the hours that followed, as the system continued to stabilize and the immediate danger gave way to a quieter kind of reflection, the energy in the room shifted from urgency to understanding, not just of what had happened, but of what it meant, because what had unfolded that night was not simply a technical problem solved under pressure. It was something far more revealing about the way decisions are made, about the way people are valued, and about the assumptions that often go unquestioned until they are forced into the light. And as the executives began to review the sequence of events, retracing the steps that had led them to that point, it became increasingly clear that the failure had not been in their intelligence or their effort, but in their perspective, in the narrow frame through which they had been viewing the problem, a frame shaped by experience, reinforced by status, and limited by the expectation that solutions must come from certain places and certain people. And standing at the center of that realization was Daniel Sterling, a man who had built his entire empire on precision and control, now confronted with the undeniable fact that the answer had come from outside the structure he trusted most, not because his system was flawed in its design, but because it had not accounted for the value of perspectives it did not recognize. And while he did not address it directly, while he did not need to, the shift in his approach could be seen in the way he listened, in the way he allowed space where he would have once imposed direction. Because the lesson was not abstract, it was immediate and personal, that intelligence does not announce itself through titles, that awareness is not guaranteed by position, and that sometimes the clearest understanding comes from those who are not trying to prove anything at all, those who are simply observing, connecting, and recognizing patterns others have overlooked. And as the room gradually returned to its normal rhythm, as conversations resumed and decisions moved forward, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed, not in the systems they operated, but in the way they would approach them going forward. Because once you have seen a solution come from an unexpected place, it becomes impossible to ignore the possibility that it could happen again, and that awareness, once gained, reshapes every decision that follows. And so, as this moment settles into memory, as the immediate tension fades and the broader meaning takes its place, it leaves behind a question that extends far beyond that room, far beyond that night. A question that challenges not just what we see, but how we choose to see it. Have you ever been in a room where no one listened until it was too late? And as the weight of that night settles, as the image of Daniel Sterling standing in a room he once fully controlled lingers, alongside the quiet presence of the waitress who saw what no one else could, it leaves behind something more personal than just a story about systems or strategy, because moments like that do not only happen in boardrooms, they happen in everyday spaces where decisions are made, voices are overlooked, and assumptions quietly shape outcomes without being questioned. And the real question is not just what happened in that room, but what would you have done if you were there? Would you have trusted your understanding enough to step forward even when no one asked you to? Or would you have stayed silent, waiting for permission that might never come? Because the line between being overlooked and being heard is often defined by a single decision, a single moment where you either speak or you don't. And as you think about that, as you consider how many times insight goes unnoticed simply because it comes from the wrong place, there is another layer to this, another story that challenges the same assumptions in a completely different way, one where the truth was hidden in plain sight until someone no one expected decided to reveal it. And if you think what happened here was intense, wait until you see what happened when a janitor exposed a $1 billion lie, because stories like these are not just about what people achieve. They are about what happens when perception is challenged and control shifts in ways no one anticipates. So if you're drawn to moments where the underestimated step forward and change everything, where quiet observation turns into undeniable impact, then this is exactly the kind of story you don't want to miss. And subscribing ensures you're there for every one of them as they unfold.